And joining us right here on the India Economic Conclave in its 5th edition is none other than former RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan. The question that we're putting forward to him is India future ready? How do we get to the $5 trillion economy? Is this all going to be about fiscal and monetary management? Does the truth lie somewhere out of that? Does the truth lie in human capital, in intellectual capital and all of that? Thank you very much, Dr. Rajan, for joining us all the way from Chicago. The first question has to be, is India future ready? And what is it that we need to do to get to a $5 trillion economy? The reason why I ask you this question first is because you now have the advantage of being a global insider of sorts. You've been in policy making here. You understand the mechanics of how Indian economy really functions, both on the monetary and the fiscal front. And now you have the advantage of seeing this with some objectivity by being outside. So are we future ready? And what is it that we need to do to get to a $5 trillion economy?
Well, I think that first, we must pat ourselves on the back a little for what we've done so far. I think 25 years of 7% growth is a good thing, and so we have come some distance. However, we are approaching middle-income country level, and that means we have to focus much more on getting our growth path straightened out. And there are some problems that are emerging that we have to be wary of. One, of course, is that we actually need more equitable growth. That today, for example, the extent of job creation is something that one must worry about in India. The reports of 25 million people applying for 90,000 railway jobs is something that suggests there's not enough supply of jobs in the market. We also have to worry about the path of growth in terms of pollution, emissions and so on. If you look at what's happening to our cities, we're choking them. And if we're doing that at our level of growth, think of what happens when we double our GDP to 5 trillion, as you suggest. So we need to do a lot more on having cleaner growth. And of course, that leads to the issue of institutions. The factor that helps us grow in a healthy way is strong institutions, whether it's the pollution regulator, the emissions regulator, or whether it's the financial regulator. So these are structures that we must strengthen. They have to stand as independent bodies to ensure our growth is healthy and stable.
You know, everybody seems to laud each other on the 7% growth, and I know you say that we've grown at 7% for 25 years. Is it really phenomenal, or is this the new Hindu rate of growth, up from the Asian 3.5% that we've seen? And the reason why I ask that question is because a $5 trillion economy will mean more and more people need to be lifted out of poverty. We need to create economic opportunities. Is 7% over a sustained period, it's been sustainable now for 25 years, but is this going to be, enough to lift these people out of poverty, create the jobs, create the necessary gainful employment that's required? Or are we somewhere stuck in the range of 7 to 7.5%?
Well, first, I wish this were the new, famous Hindu rate of growth. I am not sure. I think it's a healthy rate of growth, but it's insufficient, clearly, in terms of creating the jobs that we need. So either we need to shift some of the growth to job-creating sectors, and we haven't done that well in the past, and I'm not sure we know quite how to do it, or increase the pace of growth more generally by a couple of percentage points to absorb the people coming into the labor force. I mean, certainly a key to this stronger growth will have to be areas like construction, where building out the infrastructure that India needs employs a lot more people and creates the jobs for people leaving agriculture, as well as for modestly educated people from the urban areas. But we need to think about what we can do to create these jobs, because otherwise we have problems ahead.
India's physical infrastructure will be key to our development, and yet it hinges upon two issues. One is land acquisition, and then, of course, the other issue is environmental clearances. And these are both politically and socially sensitive. In fact, politically, it's a hot potato of sorts. How does one maneuver through this quagmire? Can there ever be a balance in these two issues in the quest of higher growth? How does one deal with the political hot potato like land acquisition and a socially sensitive, relevant issue like environmental clearances? Can we in the third world have first world aspirations? And which is why I raised the question about, can there be a balance?
I think we do it the right way, and the temptation will be to cut corners, to have draconian powers on land acquisition, or to sort of eliminate the need for environmental regulation. But I think that would be a mistake both for our long-term growth as well as a mistake given our democracy, because the more draconian you get, the more the opposition builds up. Instead, we have to find clever ways of trying to achieve the objectives that we want with these measures, while at the same time respecting the intent of environmental regulation or careful land acquisition. So we need to take people along. For example, in land acquisition, could we essentially improve the pace of the process, first by making land rights much clearer? Right now, there's a lot of states where it is quite opaque who owns the land. But second, having a decent price as well as some kind of long-term incentive for the person who parts with the land. For example, land sharing mechanisms, as we've had with the Andhra capital acquisition. So let's look for best practices in India and see how that would work. Similarly, in terms of environment, we have a lot of regulations, but if you look at some of what's happening, for example, in Delhi, or you look at the growth of a place like Shimla, you see that we haven't achieved the objective of having essentially clean growth. So how do we go about that? I think we need to spend a lot of time thinking how we manage this process sensibly without shortcuts.
One of the questions that I want to ask you, Dr. Rajan, is that I think we've been extremely lucky as far as the oil price regime is concerned. At least this government has significantly benefited from a benign oil regime. I mean, from the highs of $140 a barrel, we've actually seen the lows of sub 30 in this regime. But why is it that the same oil, and oil has been in such a huge discussion now because the last policy by the RBI called it a tailwind. It's become a headwind suddenly after the OPEC cuts and all of that. Why is it that the same oil price regime, the benign regime, could not, the same tailwind could not spur our growth further?
Well, I think that's a very legitimate question. Where has the oil windfall gone? And how does it hurt us as it comes back in the form of higher prices? But let's put that behind us. I think the key issue is the volatility of oil. And especially with geopolitical tensions, volatility is going to increase. So that suggests that there is a very strong need for a oil hedging mechanism for a country like ours, which is so dependent on oil. I think we've discussed this in the past. Of course, we've started a strategic petroleum reserve, but over and beyond that, we have to think about whether it makes sense to hedge the price of oil, especially when it comes to levels such as these. Now, of course, the problem is many who are entrusted with this fear the fallout if oil prices fall even further and you've hedged it. But that has to be taken as a natural consequence of a hedging program, and we must, as a country, think about whether we should start this process.
I do want to take this discussion beyond the realm of just pure economics and, just hard numbers on growth and oil and, investments and things like that, to really talk about issues that will spur growth. And this brings me to the discussion about the education system. Is India's education system, which has created people like yourselves and many other top-notch global CEOs, and I can name, from Satya Nadella to Sundar Pichai and people like him, what explains an impressive rise in enrollment rate but an equally sharp rise in the dropout rate in our schools and colleges? Is Indian education true perhaps only in pieces? The reason why I raise this question, Dr. Rajan, is that how crucial will this human capital be to being future ready, to being a $5 trillion economy? And do we run the risk of fewer knowledge workers in future India? And does that in some sense pose a threat to our high growth model?
Well, I think it's not just education, it's also healthcare, because the kind of nutrition, the kind of healthcare that our young get at an early age may in fact stunt them for the future and make it much harder for them to benefit from any kind of education system, let alone the education system that we have. Now, there are some good pieces of good news on education. One is that everybody eventually seems to enter the classroom. Now, whether they continue in the classroom, whether they learn enough, I think is a very different question. And the ASAR surveys, the work that Pratham has done, suggests they're not learning enough, that too few of them are essentially numerate as well as able to read in an effective way. So I think at this point we have to shift towards improving the quality of education. And that means a lot of remedial education to ensure that children are not left behind. After all, it's the children who are left behind, who don't understand anything in class, who are prime candidates for dropping out also. So now that we've got everybody into the system to begin with, let's keep them there by giving them a much better, much higher quality education than they're currently getting. And this requires tremendous work on all sides again.
I think the obvious turn that I must take at this stage from human capital is to address intellectual capital. And it amazes me that Indian companies that have led the world in IT through iconic ones like Infosys or a Wipro or a TCS are now lagging behind in issues and things that are changing the world, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's machine learning, robotics. Why is that so? Why are we not at the cusp or the cutting edge of really capitalizing on what should be intellectual capital? Are we perhaps not investing enough in the future? Are our companies not investing enough?
Well, I think this indicates that we have a lot of work to do. There are small startups. I've met some people in Bangalore who are working on artificial intelligence and machine learning. But clearly, at this point, our northern neighbor, China, has stolen a march over us in terms of how prepared we are. Now, again, there is no shortcut here. You cannot produce world-class companies in these areas without having a strong research university system which backs them. China has made that leap. If you look at Chinese universities, they've made a tremendous change over the last 10 to 15 years, and now some of them are really world-class. And I think we need to do the same in India also, focus on improving the quality of research or the quality of our universities, and as a byproduct, our companies will also get better. We were relying a lot on the companies themselves doing what was necessary. Certainly they could do some, and we had world-class companies in the IT area. Now to some extent they're falling behind as there is a shift to new areas, and we need far more research, teaching in those areas to create the human capital which can take us forward. So I think this is a wake-up call for us that we should do far more in the area of education.
I don't think I can end this growth debate without addressing a very big issue, and that is the debate over the growth data. It's not just you, but many other experts have raised questions on our macro data before in terms of what we measure, why are we measuring those. Some of those items are obsolete. But up until now, there has never been a full-blown political war, and the integrity of our GDP growth data has never been questioned, which is now under cloud. What do you make of the debate in the light of reports that say that there was a set of data on GDP figures earlier which was not allowed, then one that was gone through? The credibility of statistical system is perhaps what is really in focus, and given the fact that it is key to designing policy, are waters being muddied too much, and what is going to be the future of the economy based on this data? Are those waters being muddied really?
See, this is a current controversy that I don't think I have enough knowledge or expertise to wade into. I think the broader question you're asking is, as we go forward and become a 5 trillion economy from the 2.5 trillion plus we are now, what more do we need to do? And clearly one part of what we need to do is have robust data and reliable data so that economic decision makers can make decisions on that basis. And that means strengthening our whole statistical process. It's not just the quality of data that we have to worry about, it's also the quantity of data. That, for example, the whole area of labor, what are the unemployment numbers, how do they vary month by month? We have no idea. We really don't collect this well, and it is very important we do it quickly, because a lot of economic policy making otherwise is made in the dark. Now, as far as the overall GDP growth numbers and GDP level numbers go, I think the reality is whatever they be, we need to do more because, again, the proof of the pudding in some sense is in the eating. If 25 million people are applying for 90,000 jobs, it suggests that we're not supplying enough jobs. That means growth is not strong enough, at least in the job creating areas.
I think from someone who I think is synonymous with fault lines, like you write in one of your most famous books, what are some of the fault lines that worry you about India's macroeconomic management? Is this the current account deficit? If oil prices go up, trade disbalance? Is this the deepening fiscal fault that worries you? I mean, what are the worrying signs for you right now? What is it that you lose sleep over, the current account or the fiscal deficit?
Well, I mean, my sense is that we do have structures that can bring them back in line if they depart too much. But at this point, I think the big concern has to be with the state deficits, especially as we go into a flurry of elections with a variety of states promising, a lot of waivers, a lot of, cheap goodies in order to get votes. And this often hampers them later on because ultimately what is suffering is investment. If you look at agrarian unrest, one of the big concerns is agrarian productivity hasn't increased as much as it should. And of course, our prices are fluctuating in ways that hurt the farmer a lot. But the net effect of all this is that people are getting more and more concerned that they don't have access to good livelihoods. So I think the first order is, of course, macro stability, because the world is getting a little more dangerous for us, including the fact that oil prices are fluctuating tremendously, but also interest rates are going up. And of course, there's the fluctuations on what is going to happen on trade. But macro stability is number one. And second, focus on the sectors that are distressed, try and get them back on track. I'm talking about agriculture, I'm talking about the banking sector, talking about power, which is a distressed sector and needs to be fixed very quickly. But then also think about the long term, which is where all the talk about education and so on goes. I think there's no immediate reason to be overly concerned about India, but there is a reason to revisit our growth path and to ensure it is stable, it is sustainable, and it is equitable. All these three should be attached to stronger growth. If we can do all that, we're on the right track.
From the man who many years back rightfully predicted the big global recession of 2008, and I remember in 2005 you had warned the world about dangers of credit default swaps and possibilities of a catastrophic meltdown on account of financial market expansion. What are you going to warn the world against today? The question really is, where in the world is the next crisis brewing according to Raghuram Rajan?
You want me to be a Cassandra again? No. Look, risks build up in a period of very, very accommodative monetary policy. There are risks around the world. The enormous amount of money that's flowed into the emerging markets, the huge amount of leveraging, a lot in China, but also in the industrial West. There are pockets of high leverage in the US also, for example, the shale industry. So the combination of very easy conditions and leveraging makes us vulnerable as interest rates go up and as volatility picks up again. And we've got volatility from the process of normalization, but also geopolitical volatility introduced by the personalities who dominate the global scene today. So put all this together, it's a risky place. And can accidents happen? Of course they can happen. What's the lesson for India? Focus on the fundamentals, get them right at this point, and we will suffer the least damage that we can expect.
A quick last question then, and I think it's, I'm not going to touch upon the politics of the day or in India or overseas or anywhere else, but of all the risks out there, and I know you've said this in public domain, I just want you to explain this anymore. Of all the risks out there, why is it that you believe the underpinnings of populist movements are the most threatening of the world that we live in?
Well, I think the uncertainties created by populist actions, the whole uncertainty about trade is in fact a direct consequence of that. I think that overlaid on a process of normalizing interest rates creates a situation we haven't really experienced before. Where are you going to invest today? How do you know that where you invest is not going to be subject to 20% more tariffs, which will render the operation uneconomic? You don't even want to invest in your home country in case a competitor becomes significantly cheaper when the tariffs are withdrawn. So there's a lot of uncertainty created by this populist movement. I think they're asking the right questions. Has the global growth over the last 25 years benefited all? And there are people who haven't been benefited who are saying, what about us? That's an important question that the elite have to answer. But I think at the same time, they're proposing a whole set of policies that could be disruptive. We have to find ways to adopt the best of those policies without overturning the whole system that we have built, which has served us reasonably well, though not as equitably as we would want.
Indeed. On that note, completely out of time, thank you very, very much, Dr. Rajan, for sparing time and speaking to us on a very important topic. Is India future ready, and what is it going to take for us to get to a $5 trillion economy? We can't thank you enough for taking time out from a busy schedule all the way in Chicago and addressing some of those questions for us.
Thank you.